So, welcome to Supernova Labs, Herb Baker, uh, well, formerly of NASA. I wondered if you wanted to introduce yourself before we started a conversation about human spaceflight.
Oh, okay. Yes. So as you mentioned, I spent my entire career working for NASA, 42 years. I finally retired about 5 years ago. Spent most of my career at the Johnson Space Center, but also spent 10 years at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and 1 year at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. But again, as we were talking before we started here, that was all in the business office. I was one of those people who was not an engineer or a scientist or an astronaut. I got to work with them every day, which was wonderful. I literally loved my job. It's funny to say it like this, but there's nowhere on earth I would rather have worked than NASA. And so now that I've retired, and I also mentioned I grew up with the space program. I went to middle school and high school with the children of the original 7 astronauts and all of those that followed, and we're still friends today. And so once I retired, I joined the NASA Alumni League, which is a group of retired former NASA employees. And so now I'm on the board of directors. An officer, I'm a secretary for the board of directors of the NASA Alumni League, the Johnson Space Center chapter, which is the largest one. And so I spend a fair amount of time. Our biggest objective is to promote STEM engagement and education, and also I also volunteer for the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, which is based in Florida, and a few other nonprofit organizations. So I spend most of my time now again working for nonprofit organizations that promote STEM engagement. And I'm also, believe it or not, an amateur actor. So I'm on the board of directors for my local community theater. I've done about 20 shows since the early 1980s. Actually, comedy, drama, Shakespeare.
Best place to do these interviews then. But my question is because I've been looking into human space flight for a while now, and there's something in the UK that, I mean, we've had Tim Peake, and that's been the primary, I guess, investment, if you can call it an investment, into astronautics with the UK Space Agency. But I mean, you have been in the thick of it, from the beginning. As I was saying, I mean, not that this is anything to really go off as formal research, but I've been watching For All Mankind, and how that whole thing has progressed, and how that whole era of spaceflight from Apollo 1 all the way through to today has really developed. And one of the breakdowns I've seen here in the UK with the way that they approach space is you have that prestige and the body of knowledge to go back on and tap into when it comes to astronautics. You've been through the simulators, you've been through getting it wrong.
Right
and taking those risks. So I guess that's kind of what I really want to talk to you about today is what was going on back then, and what do you think is going right about human spaceflight right now, and what do you think we've lost maybe in the process?
Yeah, and so that made me think of a couple of things. You mentioned we've gotten it wrong, and you're right. I again, we've lost 17 astronauts, 3 in the Apollo 1 fire, one of which was the father of 2 of my friends in high school at the time.
Oh, well, that's right.
Yeah, Gus Grissom, of course. I'm friends with his sons, Mark and Scott, still today. And then, of course, we lost 7 astronauts on the Challenger and 7 in Columbia. And so that kind of leads me, one of the things I think is going right is, and gosh, we've been trying to get more, I say we, NASA, get more commercial involvement it's been, I think I actually played a small role in that back in like 2005, 2006. So it's been a while now, about 16 years.
Wow.
And again, to be honest, because of those 17 astronauts that we lost, I was a little, I'm not sure if skeptical is the right word, but worried about us starting to send astronauts to space in these privately developed vehicles. Yeah, I mean, it's a dangerous thing, no matter who's doing it. But so far, thank goodness, things have worked really well.
Yeah, Elon Musk, right? He's well,
Yeah,
SpaceX's team really has put.
yeah,
I think they've benefited a lot from the technology transfer, and like they've really taken it seriously so far to like get it like absolutely right.
Yeah, no, and interesting thing about that, of course, I feel I, I remember the last flights of the shuttle. Because I was working and actually, of course, working at NASA during the Challenger accident, and I was actually working in the space shuttle program for Columbia.
I actually have one of the Challenger patches up on my board right there.
Okay.
I have on one side I've got the Apollo Soyuz, the other side is the Challenger, because like it's like Apollo Soyuz for like what can be done, Challenger for like be careful.
And so what I was going to say is that I only got to see one shuttle launch in person, and that was amazing. But every time I watched one, I was kind of holding my breath and until they made it into orbit. So again, worried about the commercial flights, and I'm with the success of SpaceX and hopefully Boeing, a Starliner sometime soon.
When they manage to launch.
Becoming much more confident. But then that's the funny thing about that is that overconfidence is what led to the Challenger and Shuttle Columbia accidents. Things were going wrong, and we started taking them for granted because it never, the foam coming off the external tank and hitting the shuttle, that never caused any problems before until it did. So so I still, I guess to the day I die, I will always be a little anxious about putting humans in a rocket, basically a bomb, and lighting it, and sending them into space. But
well, I think that's the trivial element of it, right? Is it? It's like we've almost trivialized the fact that it is like so dangerous to get to space and surviving up in like what is like a hostile environment.
Yeah. But anyway, so hopefully trying to answer your question, I think early on there were some people who thought, because again, I was involved in the early negotiations with SpaceX. This was in 2006. I still have a document signed by Elon Musk in 2006 where we said, hey, we're going to give you millions of dollars if you will go develop your own space vehicles to carry cargo and eventually humans into space. And it took a while, but again, that's been very, very successful. And I think some people thought NASA didn't want that. It was competition. But again, that was entirely wrong, because it was our idea to offer those funds to any private company that was willing to do that. And so again, I think that's been very successful. And now with the Blue Origin and other private companies that are sending people, even if it's just into barely technically reaching space. Hey, as far as I'm concerned, the more people that we can get up high enough to see the Earth and appreciate the fragility and beauty of it and how important it is to preserve it, the better off we all are.
I agree entirely. Like I've been trying to push for the metric being like number of people in space.
Yeah.
But I mean, this kind of gets to another element of it, because I think a lot of countries have seen what SpaceX are doing, what Blue Origin's doing, what Virgin Galactic's doing, and like how they've had loads of support from NASA to like get all that technology transfer and like speak to the right people and like learn from people that have actually developed it as part of a government program. And what I guess from my own experiences, what I've seen is a lot of countries like running into developing it privately without having that, like having developed it as part of a government program, so they're able to try, like, I don't know, like to like get all of that right the first time, because it's not easy. Like it took, what's the delta between the like in the first launches and where we are right now? It's like nearly, when was it? It was nearly 70 years.
Oh gosh, yeah.
For Apollo.
Well, yeah. Well, let's see. We're actually in the midst of the 53rd anniversary of Apollo 11. I think, yeah. But of course, we had Mercury and Gemini launches 7-8 years before that. So
I guess 60 years. Okay.
John Glenn, Alan Shepard, 1961, I think, something like that. So 60 plus years. Yeah, but no, you're right, and of course, I think you're right in the sense that that was just developing a space program and space vehicles and launching people to the moon. Certainly was not something that a private company could afford to do. And it took a fair, I think it was the NASA budget in the early 60s, mid 60s for Apollo was about 3 or 4% of the United States total budget.
Wow.
It's for the last 20 or 30 years, it's been down to about 1/2 of 1%. But again, that was it took that initial investment to learn what was learned and develop what was developed, and the new technology and such. So yeah, it's hard for me to imagine a private company anywhere in any country developing that capability on their own.
I guess like going back to your time around Houston and around like in and around like NASA at that time, like I guess for me, I never saw that. I mean, I've just turned 30. Like I saw the shuttle land for the last time, and kind of felt like the dream of space flight was dying in front of us, which is like, I'm kind of glad that SpaceX has taken it forwards and NASA's now going with the Artemis program. But like, what was the vibe back then? Like, what? Because it must have been like it must have reached like fever pitch.
Yes, I actually was lucky enough as a teenager that the summer of 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, I was 17. It was the summer between my junior and senior years in high school.
Perfect time.
And I managed to get a part-time, oh, not part-time, temporary. It was full-time while it was going for with the news media covering Apollo launches, Apollo 11, 12, 13. I had gone off to college for 14 and then came back and covered Apollo 15, and then even a couple of the Skylab missions. And so I was literally on site at the Manned Spacecraft Center, right in the middle of everything as a teenager. And again, working for the news media, and it wasn't certainly I wasn't on camera, speaking into a microphone. I was running errands. My main job, in fact, it's kind of interesting. This was 1969, 1970. It was before videotape or the internet, and so when we filmed, for example, an interview with an astronaut, that film had to be physically moved from Houston to New York, where their studios were, so it could be broadcast on television. So my primary job, the main reason they hired me, was twice a day, I drove the 100-mile round trip to Houston Intercontinental Airport to take that film to be dropped off on an airplane to flown to New York. And then, of course, I did other, various things during the rest of the day. But that was, again, mainly to drive film to the airport. And so, if it's okay, I'll tell you a quick story, my favorite story from that.
Yeah, honestly, I'm here for as long as I have you.
So Apollo 12, the second lunar landing, November 1969. It was about 4 months after Apollo 11. And so again, the trips to the airport to drop off the film were for the coverage of the national TV programs. The local TV station in Houston wanted a kind of a personal coverage of Pete Conrad, who was the commander of Apollo 12 and the third man to walk on the moon. Personal interest kind of story. They wanted a film of his family sitting in their living room, not far from where I still live today, actually, watching the splashdown into the South Pacific at the end of the mission. So they sent me and a cameraman to Pete Conrad's home in El Lago, just a few miles from the Space Center. And so I was in his home with his family. I was standing over in the corner. I wasn't plopped out on the couch or anything, but I was in his living room with his family watching on their TV as Apollo 12 splashed down into the South Pacific in November 1969. And I still remember to this day, it's been over 50 years, I can remember it like it was yesterday, walking into after we were done filming, walking into the dining room, into the next room. He put the camera into a black bag so it wouldn't be exposed to light. As he took the film out, put it in a canister, handed the canister to me. I got in my car and I drove back a few miles to the Space Center. There was a helicopter waiting for me. This was about
amazing.
Yeah, this was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the local TV station, I guess, thinking back on it, I'm wondering now, why didn't they just let me drive it to the station? I guess they were so anxious to get that film and wanted to make sure they had it in time to show it on the 5 p.m. news, that they hired a helicopter to fly me the 15 miles from the Space Center to their studios. And I still remember that helicopter ride. The guy had just come back from Vietnam, flying missions in Vietnam, and I'd never been in a helicopter before. I'm 17 years old,
Well,
and just zooming down the interstate, just barely above the power lines, and I'm just hanging on, And I remember landing. I remember getting out of the helicopter, running across lanes of traffic because he had to, park the helicopter a bit away from the studio. Walking in, there was a desk off to the right. There was a woman. She knew I was coming. She was waiting for me. I remember handing her the film, and I don't remember anything after that. It was like the adrenaline just drained. I don't even remember the helicopter ride back to my car.
Wow.
But the rest of that day, I remember it like it was yesterday. So,
because that's it at that time, right? Apollo 11 had happened, and it was such a huge thing worldwide that people were putting the investment in, right?
Yeah, and that's actually what started, Moon. That story was the thought to kind of try to answer your question. Is we knew the feeling throughout the entire the whole world, and certainly even the next mission I was working was Apollo 13, and so I was on duty that evening when the explosion happened, and that was the first night I think I didn't get to go to bed that night. No one working for the news media slept that night.
Yeah, I don't think anybody slept that night.
Of course, right. And again, though, we knew. I mean, literally, people in China and Japan and throughout the entire world were glued to their TV sets, watching what was happening with that. So I think we all knew how important and how historic and what a big story what NASA was doing was at that time. But at the same time, it all seemed, for the community, those of us that had lived here for many years and had grown up with NASA, it was kind of, oh well, yeah, everybody's parent worked. I remember a story. I think it's true about a media person asking a small child that they had come across while they were covering the story. Asked if it was a child of an astronaut, a young boy, and said something, or asked him something like, well, hey, what did you think? What was it like having your father, travel to space? And the young boy, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old, thought about it for a minute and said, well, doesn't everybody's father travel to space?
Mate, if only.
He grew up in a neighborhood where, three or four of the houses on his street, were the
Uh,
homes of astronauts. And so,
blimey.
yeah, and almost every friend I had in high school, by the time I was in high school, one of their parents was involved with NASA somehow. I mean, to some extent, this whole community grew up and developed because NASA was built. The Johnson Space Manned Spacecraft Center was built here.
I see. So, do you think we have? Well, I mean, like I know that there's a lot going on right now, but like relatively, do you think we have lost that sense of adventure?
Uh, I, I, maybe I'm biased because I'm still, even though I'm not working there anymore,
Yeah.
so involved with the alumni league and things like this, going out and doing speeches and interviews and talking to students and things. I see so much, and I have so many, thank goodness for social media. I mean, again, I have literally thousands of connections,
Yeah.
and so maybe it's because
Right.
most of those tend to be people that are interested in space, so I'm still kind of surrounded by all that, news and
Oh,
interest, and
right. I
people
see.
posting stories and photos, and the James Webb was my timeline, and
Oh, it's
Facebook and
huge.
Instagram and Twitter was just,
I'm
I
joking.
didn't even post anything about James Webb because my feeds and every single social media were just full of it, and so it's I hear what you're saying, and I do think maybe to some extent the larger, you know, certainly in the United States community that is, worried about other things right now. But
Yeah.
I think we have lost some of that, but there's still a lot of it that's still out there too.
Oh
And
yeah.
that,
I know the core is like they
yeah,
are
yeah,
like
hardcore.
very hardcore, yeah. But I guess this is kind of where I'm trying to like break down that wall a little bit because like I've always kind of been like on the outside of the space industry. I don't know whether people would consider me part of the space industry here in the UK or even internationally, and whether like for good or ill. But because of that, I can kind of see what's going on in other industries, and it always. I mean, we all know what's going on like politically in
Yeah,
like the US and in the
yeah,
UK in the minute and all this kind of
right,
stuff.
right.
But it's just like you see this kind of like fundamental collapse of like a respect for evidence,
Oh,
and
yeah,
but like that time at NASA and like showcasing what science and like engineering at its absolute plenum can do,
hmm,
like inspired people to want to respect evidence and
yeah.
like and I don't know I struggle to see what's gone wrong in that process, and two, like how do you then reinvigorate that?
Yeah, and that's a boy, that's an honorable goal. I say it like that because I guess I've kind of reached a point where, and certainly as you described the political environment in the U.S., there seems to be two spectrums that are opposite of each other,
Literally.
and I guess I've kind of come to the point where I don't even try to convince or bring folks on that other side. They are where they are, and they're not going
Yeah,
to their mind. And
they all
so
believe what they want to believe.
I just want to direct all my energy to those that are interested and want to learn and believe in science and that's certainly not an ideal situation, but just trying to make the best of it.
Oh, I know. I don't blame anybody for being in that position. Like what can you tell somebody that doesn't respect like a photo in front, like, or
Yeah.
they can
Well,
set up the antenna in their garden, get the satellite image live.
I mean, there are still, it kind of hurts my brain, but there are people today who believe the Earth is flat,
Oh
And
yeah, that's
and
almost become a meme in and of itself. Like, you know, where it's
and
like people come up with a joke, and then it's kind of
yeah.
the joke becomes self-fulfilling. That now you've got people that
Well,
believe.
well, and there are people who believe the moon landings were faked,
Yeah, I know.
and
That's
you
great.
know that just that actually kind of uh, makes me angry.
I
You
mean,
know,
well, you grew up around it, right? So, like,
well,
why would they
and
put all the
again,
money in?
and again, one of my good friends lost his father in the pursuit of that goal. So
Oh
that,
wow,
you know,
yeah,
so
of course.
there's really nothing funny about it to me, you know.
No, it
Uh,
humanizes it massively. Yeah.
yeah, I did. By the way, I did get to meet Tim Peake.
Did
I
you?
think, a few years ago. He was at Johnson Space Center training. I have a photo with him, and he and I have interacted on Twitter a couple of times.
Oh, that's good. That's
So
nice.
yeah.
Like for me, I mean, well, like just out of frame here, you can see I'm currently printing one of these SpaceX helmets as we speak. But
Yeah.
for me, there's like a lot of private companies here in the UK. Well, like one in particular, called Blue Abyss, that are trying to set up an astronaut training center here, like
Mm.
completely private. Where do you see, like, with your knowledge of like what's happened in Houston, and like one thing that I really want to like get into is like the character of the astronauts that were in the space program back then versus like what NASA requirements bring in now.
Mm.
Um,
Well, no, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
so when it comes to like setting up a private, like suppose like privateers, like, yeah, I don't know, like, you know, like the old like pirates when they were like like sailing the seas on behalf of the British Empire. Um, like where do you see space for that? Like, not necessarily being pirates in space, but like when you look at like space junk and the amount of it, and it's like there is no way that any one agency is going to be able to deal with that.
Yeah.
Like, where do you see what? Well, I guess my question's in two parts, right? So it's like, where do you see it, like privateers dealing with that, like having their own ships, like training privately, getting the licenses to go up? And two, like, what was the character of those astronauts back then versus what they are now?
Well, obviously, the biggest change is back in those very early days of NASA, uh, certainly Mercury, Gemini, and even Apollo. Those astronauts, and they were mostly military pilots.
Yeah, test pilots, right?
It wasn't until actually later in the Apollo program a few scientists uh, actually, you know, traveled to the moon, and Harrison Smith, I think Apollo 17, and some of the Skylab astronauts were more scientists than pilots, because they actually had to fly those things. I mean, there were a couple of you know, Mercury Gemini missions where they might have died if they hadn't been skilled enough
Yeah,
to
I know,
get.
right? Like that G roll that
Yeah,
was
exactly what I'm
crazy.
thinking of. Exactly.
Yeah,
Whereas today, the SpaceX Dragon flies itself.
yeah, for the most part, yeah.
You don't even, you just get in, and just like as if there was a pilot flying the airplane for you. You do not have to. It can entirely, from the time it launches until the time it docks with wherever it's going, entirely automatic.
Yeah, it's not fly by
So
wire anymore. Was it fly? Is that something called fly by wire when it's like the wire directly to the wing?
yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, so that's obviously the biggest difference, and probably the biggest change in astronauts from the earliest days to today. And again, I think as far as I know, I don't know nearly as much about the Blue Origin and some of
Yeah,
those other.
their cards
I
quite close to
think
their chest, I
I
think.
think those are pretty much, you know, automatic
Mm.
too. Where you don't really need a skilled pilot to to fly them. So that's and that's good in the sense that it makes traveling in those space vehicles open to basically everyone.
Well, like private citizens piloting
Yeah,
entire missions now.
I mean, at least even in the space shuttle program, if you were not a pilot, you had to have some skill that whether it was robotics or science experiments or something that would allow you to be a valuable asset to the crew.
Well, because they were building the space station at the time, right? The shuttle was built to build the space station. I guess like this is like thinking about it in context. Like when I was born, I think the space station was already being built.
Yeah, I think I actually one of the years I spent at NASA headquarters in Washington D.C. I was out of the business world. Even then it was kind of in the business world. I was the user cost manager for the space station. This was 1985.
Interesting. What is user cost for the space station?
Yeah, yeah. So the idea was, and again, this is 13 years before we flew the first element into space.
Yeah.
But the thinking was that, okay, someday we're going to have a space station, and we're going to have, the capability or racks or whatever for people to send their experiments up into space. And we want to develop some kind of pricing policy or system for how much is NASA going to charge, and depending on how much time it takes and how heavy it is and how large it is. And obviously, just like any simple pricing exercise, you don't want to charge too little, because then there's too much demand. You don't want to charge too much because there's too. And so anyway, I for a year there, I was again working in Washington D.C. Once a month. I flew to the Jet Propulsion Lab, entirely across the country, to meet with a couple of to meet with a couple of computer scientists who were working on a computer program to try to help, come up with some method for developing a system for how much NASA would charge. And the funny thing about that is it was a great experience and lots of fun for me, and getting to travel to JPL. But 13 years later, that work we did was long gone, entirely overtaken by other factors. But
yeah, because they did open up the space station to private companies, right? You've got NanoRacks, you've got all these private companies now that are even talking about extending the space station, and have Digital have put a module on the space station, right?
Yes.
Is that even working still, or is that?
Oh yeah. In fact, there's a guy who was the what was it called, the manager or director of the space station program, Mike Staffordini, who's formed his own company now, Axiom, and he's developing a module that will be flown up and attached to the existing space station. And I mean, he certainly is very familiar with the ISS, because again, he was the director of the program.
It was his job to know, right?
But anyway, yeah, no, that's and I think I think early on I remember even some talk about him, because I think now currently the politics are such that budgets have been approved for the space station to continue to fly to 2030, and then who knows what happens after that. Is it deorbited, or does Axiom just continue to run it themselves, and it becomes their own? I have no idea how that will all turn out, but absolutely there are people and companies out there who are interested in attaching to or developing or flying a space station far into the future.
Yeah, I guess. Do you think we're falling behind in a way? I mean, I know there's a lot of private development going on with the space station, wanting to extend it. That's very new. That's very last few years that has become a feasible thing. But China now has, well, they're about to launch their second module for their space station. And when I saw the model for their space station at the UN, and this must have been about 3 or 4 years ago now, it was like a carbon copy of the ISS, but updated, like brand new screens in every bunks for all of the astronauts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like
Well,
personal laptops in each one. Like it was absolutely phenomenal, and you can stand up in every space.
well, of course, as you well know, there is no up or down in space, and
of course,
and so and that's actually an interesting subject I talk with other groups, is about what it's like trying to sleep in space, and some of the things some astronauts do to make it easier, and some of the interesting stories they have. And one of them, of course, is that that they talk about how they miss that feeling of gravity, your head sinking into a pillow, and the comfort. You don't get that in space. And so some astronauts actually have done things like taken kind of a strap and strapped their head to hold it against the
really
the sleeping bag, to kind of try to simulate that feeling,
simulate that whole thing.
So really, that's really kind of an I mean, it's a very simple,
like inner ear things, right? You kind of need to almost like trick your inner ear.
Oh yeah.
Interesting. Like, so do you think?
Well, anyway, I'm sorry. I'm not sure. I think you were asking, do I think we're falling behind? And you were talking about how the Chinese space station was so much more modernized, and I don't know.
They may be on the moon before. They may have men on the moon before we do at this rate.
Yeah. Well, and I guess even though I grew up in the time that it was a race, right, of the space race, that was actually, I assume most people know by now, that was actually a political thing. After the Russians launched Sputnik, and the U.S. was terrified that the Russians were beating us. They had a satellite orbiting the Earth, and we had done nothing.
Yeah,
and then
they sent the context of nukes as well around that time as well.
And then they sent the first man into space, and so we were far behind. And so what President Kennedy decided to do was to change the goalpost, And so, okay, well, they've beaten us with the satellite. They've beaten us with sending the first person. Let's do something crazy, like send someone to the moon, And so that's why it wasn't for the science. It was let's come up with something that we think we can do before they can, to give us a victory in this, and it worked. Thank goodness.
Spectacularly.
Right. But again, it was a very, very much a political thing and not a science thing. He wanted the U.S. to have a victory over the technology of the Russians, and it worked.
Yeah, because I guess that's it. It's like when it was that perfect union between like the political establishment and the scientific establishment, like kind of coming together to achieve a victory, right? Like it doesn't really exist anymore.
Right. No, and so really to finish my thought was that, so to be honest, I don't really, I hate to say I don't care, but if another country beats us to the moon, well, good for them. Hopefully we'll be there soon after them. And I guess all of that to say, I don't see it as a massively important race, that whoever wins, is the champion of the world, and will decide, the course of humanity for the next 50 years. So yeah, India, China, whoever, more power to you. If you can send people to the moon, or rovers to Mars, or whatever, put a space station into orbit, especially if you can contribute to, you mentioned all of the debris that, that's absolutely
a scary phenomenon.
A concern. And maybe if you're going to play in this game, you need to help be part of the solution to cleaning that up too, because if you're out there, it's a potential risk for you too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, what was the Russian anti-satellite missile test
Yeah.
recently, and they had to evacuate part of the ISS
Right.
because
Right.
the debris field is like
Yeah.
crossing the same orbit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that still the case, or have they had to like completely move orbit now?
No, I think, well, so they, that was certainly an unfortunate situation, but,
There's a lot of
you,
unfortunate situations recently.
but, but you probably know again that's just, I hate to say a small part of the problem, but in effect it is. I mean, we had an office, and still do, at the Johnson Space Center, 3 or 4 people who do nothing all day but track the debris, the pieces that are large enough to track, 24/7. And every once in a while they have, if there's an object that's headed in that direction that's a potential risk, they will move the station, up or down, or
Yeah.
one direction to move it out of the path, the potential path of that piece of debris. And that goes on. They only have to literally maneuver the station. I don't know, back when I was working, once every 2 or 3 months, a few times a year. I'm assuming it's still no more frequent than that.
Okay. Yeah. So like, there was supposed to be a centrifuge for the ISS at one point.
Yeah, and it was canceled. You're right. And I don't, to be honest, I don't remember why now. Maybe it was, there was, maybe I want to say it was because there was a feeling or a thought that it wasn't, that the benefits did not outweigh the cost and trouble to build it and send it up there. I think it was just a trade benefit analysis that it was canceled. But you're right, that was planned. I don't they had a special name for it. I don't remember what it was now, but they had planned to put a centrifuge on the space station,
because like there were bits built. Like I know that there are certain parts like test pieces that were built that are now in car parks, like in somewhere around Houston. I don't know where.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either, but I do. In fact, someone, it was probably 6 months ago, someone asked me about that, and I went back and did a little research and found out, and yeah, sure enough, that was this is what it was called, and this is why it was canceled. But I honestly don't remember the details now.
Yeah, because that would go a long way. Like, to go back to the previous point about like simulating sleep and all this kind of thing, would go a long way to like solving a lot of the issues that NASA's having right now with like more astronauts on orbit, like maintaining like physical health, and like they want to exercise about 4 hours a day.
Yeah, well, it's about 2, but you're right.
2 hours,
Yeah. But yeah, no, that is I mean, literally an hour and a half to 2 hours every single day.
Yeah, just to stop the wasting, right? Like, just not even to build muscle.
Right, and still they typically come back with some loss of strength or muscles or bone density or whatever. Right.
Yeah, because I guess this is kind of where like I want to be longer term, right? I would be very, very happy if by the time I died I was living and working in space. But like, I think there's a lot of like high ideas. Like, I know you see like the space hotels with the centrifuges. You see the private space stations, like the, what was it, Blue Origin's like orbital oasis thing. And it's like there's a lot of technologies in there that have never even been tried. And it took so long to get to this point already.
Yeah.
Like, how feasible is a lot of this stuff that people are talking about without testing it and without putting the money there?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I don't really know the answer. I mean, but you're
Oh,
right.
that's why. I mean, it's
I
like
have
just
I have the same questions. You know, even talking about. In fact, I saw something again just a couple of days ago about Elon Musk saying something to the effect of, "Yeah, you know, we may have people on Mars sooner than you think." You know, as if in the 3 or 4 years. And I just think you are. I mean, hey,
he is out of this world.
I mean, I am very impressed and you know appreciate the work you've done and what you've developed with you know SpaceX. But you are nuts if you think we're going to have humans on Mars in 3 or 4 years. I mean things like the radiation. They still don't know how they're going to protect. I mean you know because it's what 2 or 3 days to the moon. It's you know
Months, doesn't it? Yeah.
months. I mean, people say or ask, how long does it take to get to Mars? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on when you leave.
Yeah.
But
That's
you
it.
know,
There's a long
typically,
way. There's a short way.
whenever you leave, it's months, not
Yeah.
days. And so that's a huge concern is the exposure to radiation on the trip there, and they haven't solved that yet. And food. I mean, actually, they have some competitions going on trying to have companies develop ways to grow food, you know, within a spacecraft
Yeah.
and you know oxygen and water and you know maybe they've made some progress, but there's just so many things that, in my mind, unless I'm missing something, that they still haven't solved
No, I
to
agree with you.
send, you know, people to Mars. And there's Elon Musk talking about doing it in 3 or 4 years. And unless you know the secret answers to those problems and just aren't sharing them, you know, I don't think it's going to happen. And
Honestly, I think his idea is literally just like throw people at Mars until some stick. But I mean, that's not the most ethical solution, right?
but at the same time, I do understand and appreciate the technological advances that have, you know, happened and continue to happen. If you had told me 10 years ago that SpaceX would launch a rocket and it would come back and land on a ship in the middle of the ocean,
That's wild.
standing straight up, I would have said, "Oh, there's no way.
No way, yeah.
That's just impossible. That can't be done, can it?" Well, sure enough, it can.
Well, if
So,
he manages to do this with Starship, right? Like,
uh,
it opens up an entire swathe of projects that you can develop on orbit. I did some like back of the napkin calculations for on orbit solar,
mm,
and like you cannot do it until the cost per kilogram is at the level that Starship would provide.
uh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So I mean, you know, there's been a lot of people smarter than me that have pontificated about how well that's crazy and that can never be done, and we're wrong about it. But you know, hey, I'm not afraid to give my opinion.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that there's a bunch of things missing, right? Because I did some work with the Moon Village Association, and like the work they're doing is like trying to like get the basic research in place and like what would we even need to do like for like missions to like establish a lunar colony and like then the political elements of the whole thing as well. But what like two of the big pieces that keep coming up again and again and again through that is one, low Earth orbit is like not even close to being like fully commercialized or like even like just active. It's not active. It's got
Yeah,
a few spacecraft going on. It's
yeah,
got a lot of satellites, but
yeah.
not a lot of people.
Hmm.
The moon like would be a staging point to start a mission from Mars. So how would you like would just to put that in perspective, like how far away from even that we are at the minute?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. And you know, it's funny. I think back to the '60s. I was growing up. I was a teenager in the '60s, and you know, from the first manned NASA launch, I think it was 1961, to landing on the moon was just 8 years, which to me really kind of blows my mind,
Yeah, I know, like, it was
because
crazy.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, it was 2006 when I was working within an office that awarded we actually called it a Space Act agreement, not a contract, to SpaceX and another company called Rocket Plane Kistler, to again, hey,
Oh, really?
yeah, we will give you, millions of dollars to, along the way, if you do a couple of things, if you meet certain milestones and you get some other private funding in addition to what we're providing you, if you will, and this is to develop your own space, you can design it however you want. We just need it to be able to carry cargo and people someday from Earth to low Earth orbit. And that was 2006, and it wasn't until, when was a demo, the first Bob and Doug
The
demo one
demo,
in
yeah, with demo one, yeah.
2019, 2020. So that was 14 years. It wasn't until I made the calculation in my head one day. I thought, wait a minute, it took 14 years to get from that, Space Act agreement to actually getting people to the space station. And
It's almost like we lost an appetite for risk, right?
yeah, and again, that's just getting people from the ground to 200 miles up.
Yeah.
So and of course we've already sent people to the moon, 50 years ago. Of course, they only stayed for 2 or 3 days, but again, all of that to just say, that no matter how, and the pace of development of technology over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the my cell phone has more computing power than the Apollo 11 flight computer had, that flew our guys to the moon 50 years ago. So
exactly, like we have the technology to do this, and like this is kind of the so I've spent a long time the past few years like kind of feeling a little bit dejected about this, because yes, there's a lot of like phenomenal stuff going on in space that like is just needs to be protected, and it's like just like the ember in your hands right now. But when you like reflect back to that time when it was just like it's like people were more willing to take risks, and they were more willing to just like do it, like find out, instead of like having robots do all the work for us, because it's safer and we can test it all out before we go. And while I think there's like a place for it, it's like, yeah, as you were saying, it took 14 years to get from an agreement to something actually happening. Like at that rate, it's not going to happen for another century.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. And yeah, so that's kind of disheartening sometimes for me when I think about that too. But
well, so that's kind of why I was asking initially, is well, like, what was the character of like the people, and like why do you think they were able to do that?
Yeah, that's, and again, I don't really have an answer. I can, tell you what I think or speculate about it. And so one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize, within NASA, those people, flight controllers sitting in mission control, directing those flights to and from the moon, they were in their 20s. I mean, I guess the story back to Apollo 12. It was struck by lightning as it launched, and they lost all of the power in the command module, and it was 26-year-old John Aaron sitting at the ECOM electrical console, and the flight director, Jerry Griffin, probably would have had to abort the mission, which would have meant flying the 3 astronauts apart, jettisoning it from the Saturn V, and then literally blowing up the Saturn V. And who knows? Who knows if we had ever gone back to the moon again after something like that.
Yeah.
But John Aaron had been in the 26-year-old John Aaron had been in a simulation a year earlier, and he remembered that when he saw that pattern on his screen, that if you flip the SCE switch, signal conditioning electronics, to auxiliary, it resets everything. So and so there's a wonderful, one of my favorite YouTube videos. It's easy to find. Apollo
No, I mean,
12.
like, give me a link to it. I'll put it in the link to this in the description here.
So it's Apollo 12 SCE to AUX, and so it's about 4 or 5 minutes, and it tells the whole story about how Jerry Griffin, the flight director, is asking him, well, hey, what do you think? And he says, tell him to flip the SCE to aux. And it's, what? FCE? No, SCE to aux. and Pete Conrad says, what the hell is that? I have no idea.
Yeah, they have like paper manuals like this thick, right? to work out what to do.
So Alan Bean, one of the three astronauts on Apollo 12, knew where that switch was. So he reached up and flipped the switch SCE to auxiliary, and all of the power came back. He saved the mission. He was 26 years old.
Well, it's almost like it was such like, I mean, it was still complicated back then, but like relatively simple in terms of how things operated. Like each astronaut could know how the entire thing worked without needing to like have a degree in software engineering or anything like that. It's like, or at least they knew who to ask, right? There was like a room full of people they could ask.
Yeah.
And I guess so do you think that maybe that is the thing that's been lost? That like there was a lot of belief in the youth, and like they were able to like that people believed that people in their 20s, they could do this kind of stuff. Like I feel like now they look at people in their 20s like, oh, they're still a kid.
Well, yeah, I think that might have they had something to do with it. I mean, they felt invincible, maybe, but I also think that in part might have been the whole political thing. For example, the first time we sent people outside of low Earth orbit, Apollo 8, we send 3 people to another celestial body. And the kind of the way that happened, they weren't going to do it initially until I don't know, months in advance, and someone within NASA, and there may have been some political pressure, said, no, let's move that up, let's do it more. And of course, some of the responses like, you want to do what, when?
Well, like if that's not happening, right?
Yeah, well, and so of course the answer was, well, let's give it a shot. I think we can do it. And so people
why
ask
not
me,
try in 5 years? Yeah.
Sometimes people ask, what was your favorite Apollo mission? And most people will say Apollo 11. I say Apollo 8. I mean, sending those first people away from the Earth, and had never done anything like that. And
first time that humans have gone farther than anybody before, right?
Yeah. That just, wow. I mean, they were
supposed to be doing a thing with SpaceX like that. There was supposed to be a Dragon module that was supposed to be going out and going around the moon. It was supposed to be like 3 years ago.
Oh. Yeah. Well, of course, and not to change the subject too much, but also that makes me think of the very first space shuttle flight. Bob Crippen and John Young.
Yeah,
that was the first.
Wow.
That was the first, April 1981. That was the first time they had put a different shuttle vehicle on the back of the 747, and released it. They called it approach and landing test. They put it on the back of the 747 and took off, and then released it and landed it. Did some practice landings. They had never launched one before until they put 2 people in it. God, and the courage of those 2 guys sitting on top of that, it's still today just, oh my God, I
like if that was real now, and like I'd done the training, like I because there is no formal route for me to train, like I only have a bachelor's, like I can't get into ESA, like I tend to like go out on adventures, and like I know it's like scuba diving, skydiving, a science degree, and like 2,000 hours was like what it was back then that you needed. So like I'm in the simulators, I like try and like like learning flight dynamics to the best of my ability, like trying out scuba diving, trying out skydiving, like getting all the bits together like privately so that I can go. Like, I mean, honestly, stick me on a rocket, I will go tomorrow. Like, if it's the first time, like, even better.
Oh yeah,
Where
yeah.
causes the wind, man? Like, it's just like, how long are we gonna wait?
Yeah. Well, that's yeah, wow. It takes a special person
Well,
to want to do that. But
well,
I,
I've got no responsibilities. That's what it is.
hmm, yeah, I've
Um,
got a
Herb, like, I mean, like, I appreciate we've gone over the hour, but like, honestly, like, this has been like a really cathartic conversation, because like, we're just you with your knowledge of like how things were back then and like how it's developed over these years, like I think a lot of people get lost in like the like glitz and glamour of like how things are right now, and there's like kind of like a building momentum towards that. It helps to like ground it in where it's all come from. So thank you so much for your time. Like, honestly, it's been an absolute honor.
Yeah, no, as you can probably tell, I really enjoy talking about
Yeah.
that in my time growing up with the space program. And so, hey, if sometime in the future you'd like to have another conversation, just let me know, and we'll connect again.
Hey, anytime. That would be a blessing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good luck to you and your endeavors. And I do hope you make it into space someday.
Oh, I'll get there. by hook or by crook, I'm gonna get there.
That's great. Well, that's the right attitude. Sometimes people ask me, well, what's your advice to younger people? And it's kind of interesting, because one of the guys, Gene Kranz, who's kind of a iconic NASA figure, he was a flight director for Apollo 11. Well, yeah, and so he
He's
lives.
still alive, right?
Yeah. He
Thank
lives just
goodness. Yeah.
not far from me, and I've met him and talked with him several times. In fact, I have a vintage Apollo 11 flight plan, 300 pages. I got him to sign it for me one day. And so anyway, you probably also know he's kind of known for the phrase, failure is not an option. And of course, he never said that. Actually, it was a line created for the Apollo 13 movie script.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And so, but then he kind of took it on, and so now in fact, I think he signed my flight plan. Failure is not an option. He wrote a book. The title of the book is Failure is Not an Option.
Okay, nice.
But all of that to say, so the advice I give people who are interested in space and want to have a job in the space industry or be an astronaut, something like, no. Failure is an option. Failure is a requirement. The old story about if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. And I absolutely firmly believe that. And it's everything you want is just on the other side of fear. And so that I see so many, and I think for part of my life I was limited by some of the things I did because I was afraid to fail, or afraid what might happen. And I finally realized, oh, this is crazy. I'm going for it. That's kind of how I got started in acting. I was 30 years old. I wasn't even in my plays in high school, and I finally thought, I want to try that. I think I could do that. And I wasn't afraid of embarrassing myself. And so now, 40 years later, I've done 20 shows, musicals, comedies, dramas. I'm on the board of directors of the theater. I love it. Boy, there is nothing like performing on stage and live theater. And I never would have experienced that if I hadn't gotten over the, oh, well, I don't want to go out on stage and make a fool of myself or forget my lines or something like that. Forget that. Just do it.
I had I used to be in a choir a long time ago. One of the conductors we had always used to say, "Loud and wrong."
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it's been fun.
Yeah,
And
I'd love to have another conversation with you again, Herb.
yeah,
I mean, it's just there are so many questions I want to ask, but like just for the spirit of time, I'm gonna like stop. I'll stop the recording now.
okay.